to come on up. Let's give them a round of applause, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys have any energy left? All right. I was here about September, I think. Many of you were here. And gave a talk on what happens if Trump loses, which backup plan. And we talked a lot about states. And right after I gave that talk, New American Magazine of the John Birch Society, after I gave the talk on, they came out with this issue, or a reprint called Make America States Again. And I was like, I wish they had printed it like when I gave my presentation. So if you want to know more about that, that's not why we're here tonight. A little commercial first. John Birch Society held their national conference last year in California. This year it's coming to this area, King of Prussia, September 13th, Saturday, September 13th. One of the speakers is Alex Newman. I don't know if you know Alex. All over the place. Glenn Beck keeps having him back on. Captain Austin Fitz. Anybody watch Tucker Carlson this week? He was interviewing Captain Austin Fitz. She will be a speaker. General Michael Flynn will be one of our speakers. And we have more people lined up from that. So if you're interested, you go to jbs.org/25. So. For any of you who don't know me, my name is Giordano. I live in South Jersey. I've been a volunteer for the John Birch Society since 1994. Spent my career in the radio business, most of the time at B101 in Philadelphia as the Director of National Sales. But in 2020, I had a great career, but it was time to take everything that I learned, and I'm on staff as a national field director for the regional director for the John Birch Society. So, I guess I got to say one, right? Next one. Robert Wells, founder of the John Birch Society. It's getting late, so I'm going to skip it. All right. So, President Trump wants to implement the John Birch Society's Reclaim the Panama Canal campaign. 25 years later, this is the New American publication of the John Birch Society. It's a 1999 issue, and also our January 2000 issue. And pictured is our 1999 and 2000 issue, and I so desperately wanted to do this presentation when Trump started talking about it. Started to write it, but I realized that I could not do a better job than what John McManus did. Because in 2000, John McManus, the former president of the John Birch Society, gave a brilliant speech on reclaiming the Panama Canal. Unfortunately, we lost Jack last year, about 89 years old. And I traveled to South Jersey from around 2011 to 2014 with a series of speeches with him. And one day he handed me a thumb drive, and he said, I said, what's this? He said, these are my presentations. And I said, what do you want me to do with these? And he was basically saying, I'm getting older, you can do these. So yeah, I'm going to do this one. Usually I don't take notes, but I did make some adjustments to his presentation. But, next slide. I got to turn around and see. So taking back the canal sounds a lot like an aggressive country. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy. I don't know about Canada. Canada's and that's big on that because that's really close to a North American Union. I know what the locals want to try to do with that. But taking back the Panama Canal kind of sounds like aggressive, but if you know the history of the canal giveaway, the United States has every reason to reclaim it. Giving it away wasn't just a mistake, it was part of a masterful plan of the New World Order. The U.S. Canal and the Canal Zone was officially handed over to the Panamanian government on December the 31st, 1999. And the canal was paid for by the people of the United States. It was built by American engineering geniuses, and it was constructed only after medical experts conquered diseases that had ravaged the area. The canal was justifiably been labeled as one of the greatest accomplishments of mankind. And some of our leaders at the time thought it was handing over the canal was a fine idea. And some felt the giveaway was a monumental mistake or just plain stupidity at the highest level of government. But there are others who see a much darker aspect of this betrayal of American interest. For many decades, there has been a powerful movement to cancel the sovereignty of all nations and bring us into a world government, and established by the United Nations as an all-powerful world government. You must know that to understand the giveaway. In 1992, then Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali, stated, quote, "The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty is past. Its theory was never matched by reality," quote, end quote. Next slide. In January 2000, his successor Kofi Annan said, "State sovereignty in its most basic sense is being redefined by the forces of globalization and international cooperation. It ought to be obvious to everyone that national sovereignty is their target, and world rule by the UN is their goal." Today, I'm here to speak about the canal and some of the history which must be considered. In 1878, a French group led by Fernando de Lesseps, the man who led the building of the Suez Canal, that connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, turned his attention to the 22.5-mile isthmus that what was then a portion of the nation of Colombia. After 8 years, 20,000 deaths, and the expenditure of an enormous sum of money, the French gave up. Next slide. Still, the obvious advantage of having a waterway connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, the midpoint between the two American continents, spurred our own government to investigate the possibility of taking over the project. And in 1902, Congress passed the Spooner Act, authorizing the President to acquire a zone for constructing the canal. Next slide. One of the first fruits of that act saw that the U.S. purchased everything from the French had left behind for $40 million. Earlier in 1903, there was no nation known as Panama, the area in question being a province of the nation of Colombia. Next slide. Secretary of State John Hay and his counterpart in Colombia crafted the Hay-Huron Treaty, I should say. They called for a 6-mile wide zone under joint U.S.-Colombian sovereignty and a payment of $10 million to Colombia, and annual future payments of $250,000 to that nation. Next slide. The treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate, but it was rejected by the Colombian government. So the Hay-Huron Treaty died. And when it did, the people living in Panama District of Colombia revolted. They wanted the canal through the region because they correctly assumed this would bring prosperity and an economic boom to their region. Before the year 1903 ended, Secretary of State Hay negotiated a new treaty with the Republic of Panama Representative Philippe Jean Brunet Varela. It stated that part, quote, "The Republic of Panama grants to the United States in perpetuity the use, occupation, and control of a width of 10 miles across the isthmus of Panama." Next slide. The Hay-Huron Treaty was ratified by both nations before the end of 1903. As part of this treaty, the United States paid Panama $10 million and agreed to an annual payment of $250,000, a figure that has steadily risen into the millions. Then they paid Colombia $25 million. And as I mentioned before, the French company received $40 million. Also, we paid all private property owners within the canal zone for their holdings. The U.S. actually paid for the land 4 times. The entire monetary cost before the first American worker even arrived on the scene was $163 million, a huge sum in those days. By the time the canal was completed, the U.S. had spent over $6 billion, more than the cost of acquiring Florida, Alaska, the Louisiana Purchase, and other territories. Next slide. It took the next 11 years until 1914 to complete the canal. American ingenuity, know-how, medical expertise, and determination to triumph over disease, weather, terrain, even occasional political turmoil. A ship's journey between the Atlantic and to the Pacific had been shortened by 30 days and 8,000 miles. Next slide. To to commerce greatly benefited the United States, but it also benefited all other countries throughout the world. More than 13,000 commercial vessels use the waterway every year. As for the canal's military significance to our nation, there is no question about its value. Early challenges to the U.S. territorial rights to the zone led the Supreme Court in 1907, after examining all the related documents, to rule as follows, quote, "It is hypocritical to contend that the title to the United States is imperfect and its territory described does not belong to this nation," end quote. The canal zone was as much U.S. property as Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and numerous other possessions. And U.S. rights to property had been ceded in perpetuity. But the canal's value as one of the world's most strategic waterways has never escaped the attention of America's enemies. Those who had had the United States become merely one province in a tyrannical world government have worked for many years to weaken our country and to make possible and even reasonable the merger of our nation with the rest of mankind under a supernatural authority. Taking the Panama Canal away from the United States was an early goal of the One World Force. In other words, I'm saying the loss of the U.S. ownership and control of this hugely important asset did not happen because of some mistake or some blunder, stupidity, or a loss of common sense. It was always part of a sinister plan that had been worked on for almost the entire life of the canal itself. In 1939, for instance, the Roosevelt administration pressured the Senate to ratify another treaty that would give Panama an entirely new status relative to the canal. Provisions of the 1903 treaty allowed the U.S. to acquire land and build military bases outside 10-mile wide canal zone, and those provisions were canceled. Another provision of 1903, whereby the U.S. guaranteed the independence of the Republic of China, was also terminated. Also canceled was the U.S. power to maintain public order in the nation of Panama, if its own government couldn't do so. The 1939 treaty had been signed by diplomats from both nations in 1936, but it took 3 years for resistance to it in the Senate to be broken down to the point where it is ratified by that body. Next slide. By then, in 1939, the world government promoting Council on Foreign Relations had moved into the State Department and begun dominating its domination of the foreign policy of our own nation's government. After World War II, revolutionaries in Panama, emboldened by the capitulation accomplished in 1939, generated a movement calling for full control of the canal to be shifted to Panama. Remember, the Council on Foreign Relations was started by Edward Mandel House. He believed in world government as described by Karl Marx, and he said it in his own book, Philip Drew the Administrator. Next slide. In Washington, in 1946, a State Department official had been a key figure in the formation of the United Nations during the previous year, Albert Hiss. He sent the UN a list of what he termed as America's occupied territories. He brazenly included the Panama Canal zone in his list. Hiss had not even consulted with or advised Spielberg, our nation's Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, who supposedly was the nation's top diplomat to all matters related to Latin America. Next slide. The outrageous inclusion of the canal zone by Hiss in his listing of occupied territories was immediately supported by acting Secretary of State at the time, Dean Acheson. Spielberg, a veteran of many years of diplomatic service throughout Latin America, found himself confronted by two sellout artists, one above him and one below. It's worth considering what became of these three men I mentioned. Next slide. Hiss, Acheson, and Spielberg. Hiss was eventually exposed as a communist, and he went to prison for lying about his party membership. President Truman soon promoted Acheson as Secretary of State. And after Hiss was fully exposed as a communist agent, this Secretary of State boldly stated, quote, "I'll never turn my back on Arthur Hiss," end quote. And he never did. Here was our nation's top foreign service officials supporting a convicted communist agent, both of them considered the Panama Canal to be occupied territory, not outright possession. The key to understanding what Hiss and Atchison were up to is that both were members of the little-known Council on Foreign Relations. Years later, looking back on the Hiss-Atchison performance regarding Panama, diplomats Bill Braden stated, quote, "I was infuriated by the stupidity, which I then thought it was, of putting the Panama Canal in the category of occupied territory. But I did not realize its full significance until after Hiss's other activities were exposed," end quote. In other words, it was originally believed that Hiss-Atchison categorization of the Panama Canal as occupied territory was stupidity, but he later changed his mind and no longer felt that Hiss was merely stupid after Hiss was exposed as a communist. 13 years later, Stroll joined the John Birch Society and he served as a member of the organization's National Council. Neither Hiss or Atchison were stupid men. Their actions constituted deliberate subversion of America's interest in conspiracy. The next significant move against the U.S. rights in the Canal Zone occurred when President Eisenhower gave in to demands of communist agitators in Panama, and he ordered the flying of the Panamanian flag alongside the U.S. flag in the Canal Zone. Eisenhower thumbed his nose at House Vote 382 to 12 against the very concession, and the House members let him get away with it. President Kennedy then expanded the practice by ordering the flying of the Panamanian flag in every location where the U.S. flag was flying. All this stimulated agitation in Panama against U.S. rights. Rioting in Panama during the Johnson administration then led Secretary of the Army Cyrus Vance to go to Panama and placate further the anti-Americans with more concessions that watered down U.S. rights and further emboldened the leftists. Next slide. Henry Kissinger, the most important figure in the Nixon administration, ushered in the next development. In 1973, he proposed the creation of, quote, a termination formula, end quote, to end U.S. rights completely over the Canal Zone. President Nixon supported the idea. And in October 1973, Nixon went to Panama and met with Panamanian leaders. Before too long, Kissinger had stimulated a completely false contention in the minds of many, especially those in Panama, that the Canal Zone belonged to Panama. And yet the evidence was overwhelming that Panama was led by a group of communists and communist sympathizers. Kissinger again flew to Panama for a meeting with Panama's communist dictator Omar Torrijos. Kissinger and Torrijos' meeting in 1974 produced the signing of a, quote, principles of agreement. It contained a U.S. pledge to turn the canal over to Panama. Torrijos had seized power in Panama in 1968, only 11 days after the legally elected government of Arnulfo Arias had taken office. Next slide. He then established a repressive dictatorship allied himself with Fidel Castro, initiated friendly relationships with the Soviet Union, outlawed all opposition. The nation of Panama was in the grip of communist tyranny, whose leaders included several individuals, including Torrijos' own brother, who were known by U.S. anti-drug officials to be shipping heroin into our country. This is the government befriended by Henry Kissinger. And at the time, Kissinger was working with Ellsworth Bunker, who was functioning as our nation's ambassador at large. The two insisted that the new treaty was needed in order to avoid violence in Panama and guarantee world peace. As for peace, world peace that is, being guaranteed by giving away the Panama Canal, peace is never achieved by capitulation to threats. In August 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in the wake of the Watergate scandal, and Gerald Ford became president. In his very first meeting with the press after Nixon's resignation, Ford dwelled at length on the importance to our nation of Henry Kissinger remaining Secretary of State. And that's when the Kissinger betrayal didn't skip a beat. And in 1975, Kissinger's comrade Ellsworth Bunker delivered a major address to Los Angeles in which he claimed, and I quote, Sovereignty is perhaps the main issue raised by opponents of a new treaty, but it is clear under the law we do not have sovereignty, end quote. And that's a lie. According to the U.S. Constitution, both houses of Congress must approve the disposition of any U.S. territory. If the U.S. were merely a tenant in the canal, as the Panamanian officials stated, and these high-ranking U.S. diplomats were maintaining, then only the Senate, in its treaty-ratifying prerogative, would have a voice in altering U.S. status in Panama. Now we got the race line. With Kissinger pledged already on the table, Jimmy Carter and his entourage took control of the nation's government in 1977. For Secretary of State, Carter chose Van Smith, who had already participated in watering down America's rights during the Johnson administration. For his chief negotiators in dealing with Panama, he chose the ever-present Elmore Butler and Saul Linowitz, a former registered foreign agent of the communist-led Chilean regime. At the time, Linowitz was also a board member of the New York Marine Midland Bank, the sole financial agent for the government of Panama in the United States. Because of Linowitz's past, and especially because of his relationship with Panama's New York Bank, his chances of being confirmed to the post by the Senate were mighty slim. So Jimmy Carter awarded him a temporary 6-month appointment. It didn't require Senate confirmation. Is that not evidence of conspiracy? Yet the Senate allowed Carter to get away with it, and the treaties were eventually signed. Part of the agreement called for delivering $40 million to Panama, enough for Panama to settle its debt with Saul Linowitz's Marine Midland Bank. These people take care of themselves. Just prior to Carter's election in 1976, Carter had stated during a campaign speech, and I quote, "I would never give up control of the Panama Canal," end quote. And he also said, quote, "I will never lie to you." And there we have 2 lies, one right after the other. Immediately after his inauguration, Carter announced that his top priority in the field of foreign policy would be the negotiation of a new treaty based on the Kissinger-arranged pledge in 1974. This was exactly the opposite of his campaign promise. Polls at the time showed the American people were over 80% opposed to any surrender of the canal. It's perfectly reasonable to conclude that Carter had planned to reverse that pledge all along, and that his promise during the campaign was a deliberate lie designed to gain votes. Is this not evidence of conspiracy? Next slide. By the end of 1977, the Carter-Torrijos Treaty had been hammered out, and getting it ratified by the required 2/3 majority of the Senate was the next hurdle. So on February 1st, 1978, Carter delivered a nationwide televised address that he called Fireside Chat, and it was full of outright lies. For instance, he stated, "We do not own the canal, we never had sovereignty over the zone." But in 1907, a Supreme Court ruling, I had stated earlier, as I mentioned previously, the complete opposite. His decision was reaffirmed in 1971 and again upheld in 1972. But Jimmy Carter, the man who insisted he would never lie, claimed that, quote, "The court had repeatedly acknowledged the sovereignty of Panama," end quote. That was another incredible falsehood. Further along in his Fireside Chat, Carter claimed, quote, "We have made an annual payment to Panama for the use of their land," end quote. He even referred to this annual payment as rent, while insisting that one who pays rent does not own the property in question. But the U.S. owns the canal. The canal zone was not rented, and he knew it. Carter's speech was an incredible performance. The Carter-Torrijos Treaty, sent to the Senate in 1978, was even worse from the U.S. perspective, that the pact had been hammered out by Kissinger a few years earlier, and the new treaty failed to contain a clear-cut right for our nation to defend the canal militarily. So to persuade senators to ratify the sellout, a second treaty, known as the Neutrality Treaty, was offered along with the pact, designed to transfer the property. Next slide. This is why any discussion of this matter makes reference to treaties, 2 of them, not a single one. When the time came to vote on the matter, the neutrality treaty came before the Senate first. And because there were still strong objections to it, Carter enlisted the help of Senator Dennis DeConcini. The Arizona senator offered a reservation to the neutrality treaty that plainly and simply guaranteed our nation's right to defend the canal unilaterally, to keep it open with military force if needed. The Carter knew the Panama's officials would not accept the reservation, yet he refused to tell the Senate what he knew. The Senate then approved the DeConcini reservation and added to it the U.S. version, the pact, then ratified it on March 16, 1978. And in his diary on March 15, 1978, the day before the Senate ratification, Carter wrote of his awareness that Torrijos, quote, was planning to reject the treaties outright because of the same language that DeConcini insisted upon, close quote. This information is contained in Carter's own 1982 book, Keeping Faith. In other words, Carter knew that Panama would not accept the DeConcini language, and he kept this knowledge from the Senate, who insisted, were persuaded that all would be fine with the government of Panama. Also, Carter even suggested to Torrijos, that the Panamanian dictator should issue his own reservation dealing with the same matter contained in the DeConcini language. This the Panamanian promptly did, and this meant that the two documents ratified by the U.S. and Panama were not identical. As any honest expert in international law will confirm, there is no treaty because the parties to do it did not sign the same document. In Keeping Faith, his book, Carter also admitted that the DeConcini reservation was absolutely necessary in order to persuade senators to approve the ratification. When he held back his knowledge, that Panama wouldn't accept it prior to the ratification of the second treaty. 1 month later, he had more opportunity to inform the Senate that Torrijos had added his own 3-paragraph reservation to the neutrality treaty. He was constitutionally required to pass along what he knew, but he never did. He participated in a huge fraud, an act that he later said was his greatest triumph. I call it evidence of conspiracy, and I find it most significant that Torrijos included reference to U.S. and Panamanian commitments to the United Nations in his reservation to the treaty. There are people who prefer to claim that Carter did what he did and avoided doing what he should have done because he didn't want his project to fail at the last moment. There are some Americans who will defend Carter as a peace-loving man who didn't want to see bloodshed if the treaties weren't ratified. But all these excuses for Carter overlook his dishonesty, and they overlook the connections of many key players in his long-running betrayal. Who were these key players? Let's start with Alger Hiss and Dean Acheson. Move on to Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Continue with Cyrus Vance and Henry Kissinger and Ellsworth Bunker and Saul Linowitz. All these men, every single one of them, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. In subsequent years, both Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford were also welcomed into the ranks of the sovereignty compromising cabal of one world. Carter didn't arrange the giveaway, he just cooperated with the people who were really in charge. His administration was top to bottom CFR control with Vice President Mondale, Secretary of State Vance, Secretary of Treasury Blumenthal, Secretary of Defense Brown, and many others who held membership in David Rockefeller's group. Next slide. And Carter himself was then a member of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, a new group equally desirous of plunging our nation into a world government. Next slide. Another critically important supporter of this giveaway was well-known columnist William F. Buckley Jr. His published approval of the arrangement led several senators to take to state that the treaties must be okay, that Buckley approved it. What they likely didn't know is that Buckley was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a member of Skull and Bones and the CIA. Opponents of the treaties at the time, back in the 70s, pointed to the communists running Panama, and pointed their close relationship with Fidel Castro as a possible takeover of the canal, not by Panama, but by the Soviet Union. And this was a valid concern back in 1970. Today, of course, the situation has changed, and the Soviet Union is no more, though communism in Russia is still a concern. But China moved into the Panama Canal area in a big way into the entire nation. Let me briefly outline the China's presence in Panama by quoting retired Thomas Moore, former chairman of Chiefs of Staff. Next one. In an article appearing in August 2nd, 1999 issue of the John Birch Society's New American magazine, we see his top priority Admiral Thomas Moore. He testified numerous times before Congress about the Panama Canal and the zone in this article, and he stated the following, quote, "The Chinese penetration of Panama has been effected primarily through the entity known as Panama Port Company and the Front Corporation of Hutchison Whampoa Limited, a Chinese-controlled company owned by Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing. Hutchison Whampoa is a partner with the China Ocean Shipping Company and the merchant marine arm of the People's Liberation Army of China." The Admiral further pointed out that Panama's 1997 Law Number 5 has given China power to hire pilots for the ships transiting through the canal, to control the ports at each end of the canal, to set the order of the ships to use the canal, and additional power to deny its use to some ships. By this law, Panama has allowed China to take over former U.S. military bases in the zone. Admiral Moore summed up his deep concern as follows again in this article. He said, quote, "But my specific concerns is that Beijing, operating through this company, has virtually achieved, without a single fire shot, a stronghold on the Panama Canal, something which took our country so many years and tremendous efforts to accomplish." Next slide. For just one example of what interrupted use of the canal would mean to our nation's military, consider a point made by retired Admiral Clarence A. Hill. He stated, quote, "that logistics through the canal are an extremely important consideration." How important? The Admiral stated, quote, "the carrier's aircraft would run out of fuel in 5.5 days and out of ammunition for its planes in 3.5 days. He said it ought to be obvious that a steady stream of supply ships is needed to make those aircraft carriers effective. And he noted supply ships have used the Panama Canal extensively in the past." Next slide. Another authority, Captain Kenneth Puckett, a veteran of several decades of piloting ships through the canal, pointed out to the commercial importance of the waterway. Each year, he has stated, over 190 million tons of cargo pass through the canal. He worries about our ports, our railroads, our highways. They could virtually be shut down by the ensuing gridlock in attempting to get that cargo across the nation on our roads and on our railroads. Next slide. In 2009, this is an article from the New American, but George Soros declared in the Financial Times, "I think you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order." China has military plans to conquer our nation. The goal of those who conspire on a world level, and that includes numerous individuals from this country, from this nation, is simply and plainly a totalitarian world government. So whatever advances that goal is what we should be looking at, and even while we remain conscious of China's rapidly growing military. President Clinton was handing over top secret technology to Chinese government while receiving funds for his re-election campaign. And as for the canal itself, President Clinton let the cat out of the bag in December of that year, 1999, when he said, quote, "The Chinese will be bending over backwards to make sure that they run it in a competent, fair, and able manner," end quote. His aides quickly informed him that he had misspoken. They went on and told the press the same thing. He really didn't mean that the Chinese would actually be running the canal. So while the W. Bush and Obama administrations did not stop the flow of immigration, the Biden administration And I want to stress, this is not the Biden immigration policy. The Biden administration, he's a puppet. And he was implementing the United Nations migrant policy, completely opening the border with reports of young, violent youth, including Chinese, coming through the Darien Gap right in Panama. Those organizations of the United Nations include such organizations like the International Organization for Migration, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the Global Compact for Migration, and the Global Compact on Refugees. So to the surprise of many, including us in the John Birch Society, President Trump, who sounded extreme, is not extreme at all. President Trump recently announced that the U.S. would reclaim the canal. However, recently, next slide. However, recently, then news outlets announced that C.K. Hutchinson Holdings had brokered a deal to offload its Panama Canal holdings to a consortium headed by BlackRock. Now, C.K. Hutchinson Holdings was China's way of controlling the canal and influenced the Panamanian government. This $23 billion BlackRock deal, which has to be approved by the Panama government, is so our extensive concerns don't end here. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a promoter of World Economic Forum's Great Reset. Fink used BlackRock to push DEI, ESG, Agenda 2030, Net Zero, Green New Deal, carbon capture. BlackRock is a corporate member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So what do we do about all this? One talk, take action. I heard Tom, talk about we got to do something. So what do we do? A truly Americanist government would undertake these 3 steps, 2 of which should have been done long ago. The 2 are first, withdrawal of diplomatic recognition from China. Remember, this part of the speech I did not change. John McMahon said this in 2000. And boost import taxes on all goods into this nation from its slave labor weight industries. I love Trump's policies. The Berks Society's view is his treaty policies and taxes are great. He's just doing it unconstitutionally the wrong way, but I love that he's doing it. But next slide. The second step is, which should have been taken a long time ago, is withdraw the United States from the United Nations. Yes. It's time to let the world know that this nation is not going to be dragged, pushed, or led into the New World Order. And the third step, something that can be done currently and should be done, one that will begin the process toward accomplishing the other steps that I've mentioned, is to have Congress pass a House Joint Resolution that calls for notice to be given to Panama that the Carter-Torrijos treaties are null and void. They're 2 different documents. And that the 1903 Hay-Grena-Varela Treaty remains legally binding. Anyone familiar with the international law, especially the 1969 Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, knows that such a difference renders the agreement null. Also, the resolution notes that according to Jefferson's Manual of the Rules of the House of Representatives, a copy of which is present in each congressional office, treaties are legislative acts that can be rescinded only by Congress, not the President. The President has no role. Congress, which is something else I want to bring up, is we're all excited that Trump got in office, but we've got midterms we have to concentrate on. It's another reason to keep coming to these meetings. Therefore, it's Congress. Since Congress has not rescinded the Hay-Grena-Varela Treaty of 1903, the pact remains in effect. So what we have here is, for more information on next slide. So for more information on this, and to get petitions, you can go to the John Birch Society, jbs.org. More specifically, jbs.org/canal. That'll come up. You get all this information, you drop down petitions. There's a wealth of information there, check us out. Do we need to reclaim a canal petition? Let me specifically recommend that you help President Trump with this effort to obtain a petition with signatures on our table over here or download it. And ask your congressman, who is Ryan McKenzie, right?
Yeah.
Okay? Tell him to support, I didn't mention, back in 2000 when I was involved, that Helen Chenoweth from Idaho introduced a resolution 77 to bring the canal down. We need to get that bill and sign it now. And Ryan McKenzie can do that. That's your representative. So I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
have a very good night.
Thank you so much for coming out, for being patient, and we'll have them back, folks. You did a great job. So thank you again, David.